A lot of writers hear literary terms all the time and kind of half recognize them. You've probably heard words like tone, symbolism, motif, and maybe you sort of know what they mean, but not well enough that you'd feel confident explaining them or using them to talk about your own writing. First, we're going to look at the language and style layer, terms that shape how the writing feels on the page. Then we'll move into the meaning layer. These are terms that help us talk about what a story represents or what ideas it's exploring. And finally, we'll get into the story craft layer, which are terms that affect how a story is delivered to the reader. And I'm really excited to walk through examples pulled from some of my favorite books across fantasy, horror, and speculative fiction. So let's start with the language and style layer. The first term is tone. Tone is the author's attitude toward the subject, the scene, or even the characters they're describing. In other words, it's the emotional quality carried by the writing itself, and it shapes how the prose comes across to us as readers. A piece of writing can sound playful, detached, hopeful, warm, serious, ironic, or unsettling. And those choices affect how we experience a story before we even start analyzing what that story means. For the next few turns, I'm going to use one of my favorite Gothic horror books, which is Mexican Gothic. One of the clearest things that this book does really well is establish an eerie, unsettling, serious tone almost immediately. The writing doesn't feel cozy, casual, or lighthearted. Instead, it feels decayed and ominous, maybe a little bit poisoned, like something is wrong beneath the surface before we're ever told anything is wrong. And that effect comes from the way the prose presents the world to us. The descriptions, the atmosphere, and the emotional shading of the language all carry this sense of unease. And that's what tone is. It's not just the events that are happening, it's the attitude the writing brings to those events. And in Mexican Gothic, that attitude is dark, eerie, and foreboding, which helps set up the entire reading experience. Now, people often confuse tone with mood because the two are closely connected, but they are not the same thing. Mood is the emotional atmosphere experienced by the reader. So if tone is what the writing is doing on the page, mood is what the writing creates in you as you move through the scene. Tone comes from the author's language and attitude, while mood is the emotional response that language helps build in the reader. So in Mexican Gothic, the mood feels mysterious at first because both the character and the reader can sense that something is wrong without fully understanding what it is yet. But as the story goes on, that mystery starts to harden into unease, dread, discomfort, and a kind of claustrophobic tension. You feel like the house is pressing in, and you feel like something is off in every interaction. You feel trapped with the character inside a place that seems to be hiding something rotten under the surface. And that's mood. It's the emotional atmosphere the story creates for the reader as you experience it. So a simple way to remember this difference is that tone belongs more to the page, while mood belongs more to the reader. The tone in Mexican Gothic is eerie, sinister, and the mood that the tone creates is one of mystery, unease, and growing dread. Next is imagery. Imagery is descriptive language that creates a mental picture or appeals to the senses. It helps the reader see, hear, feel, smell, or even taste what's happening in the story, which is why imagery is such an important part of atmosphere. When a book has strong imagery, it doesn't just tell you that a place is creepy or beautiful or decayed. It gives you details that lets you experience that feeling for yourself. And Mexican Gothic gives us a really strong example of that in the description of the house. It looked absolutely Victorian in construction with its broken shingles, elaborate ornamentation, and dirty bay windows. The house loomed over them like a great quiet gargoyle. It might have been foreboding, evoking images of ghosts and haunting places, if it had not seemed so tired. The slats missing from a couple of shutters, the ebony porch groaning as they made their way up the steps to the door, which came complete with a silver knocker shaped like a fist dangling from a circle. That's a strong imagery example because it works on multiple levels at once. You can clearly see the broken shingles, the dirty bay windows, the missing slats, and the elaborate ornamentation. You can also hear the porch groaning as they walk up the steps. And beyond the literal description, all of those details create a vivid sensory impression of age, neglect, and Gothic unease. So imagery is not just description for the sake of description, it's description that helps the reader experience the scene more vividly and emotionally. In this case, the imagery makes the house feel decayed, haunted, and oppressive before the story even has to directly tell us to be afraid of it. Now let's move on to simile. A simile is a comparison using the words like or as, and one line from Mexican Gothic that works really well is, "Their voices were like the buzzing of insects." It's a simile because the voices are being compared to buzzing insects using the word like. And what I like about this example is that it makes the voices feel irritating, invasive, and unsettling. So yes, it's a simile, but it's also contributing to the mood. Similes often do double duty. It helps us picture or hear something, but it also adds emotion or atmosphere. And I have a whole video about similes if you want to learn more. So then that leads naturally into metaphor. A metaphor is also a comparison, but it does not use like or as. Instead, it treats one thing as if it is another thing. So if the simile is, "Their voices were like the buzzing of insects," you can turn that into a metaphor by writing something like, "Their voices were a swarm of buzzing insects." Now the comparison is more direct. You're not saying the voices are like insects, you're treating them as if they are insects. This is another way to use description that creates interest and an evocative way for readers to connect and understand the scene. So that's the language and style layer. These are all terms that shape how the writing feels and sounds on the page. Now let's move into the meaning layer. The first term here is allegory. Allegory is when a story operates on a larger representational level, meaning the story as a whole can be read as standing for larger ideas, moral qualities, or social realities beyond the literal events on the page. And for allegory, I want to use the Metamorphosis. Gregor's transformation into an insect is not just a bizarre plot event meant to shock the reader. It's something many readers interpret allegorically because the transformation can be read as representing much larger human experiences. You can read it as a story about alienation, dehumanization, loss of identity, disability, or the way modern life reduces people to their usefulness. Gregor turns into something his family can no longer understand, accept, or value, and that exposes how quickly dignity and belonging can disappear when a person is no longer seen as useful. The meaning is not confined to one object or one repeated image. The entire premise is doing a larger representational work. Gregor's condition changes the way his family treats him, the way he sees himself, and the role he's allowed to occupy in the world. And all of that can be read as pointing beyond the literal plot. Next is theme. Theme is the central idea or message a story explores. It's the larger question, concern, or insight running underneath the plot. And yes, stories can absolutely have more than one theme because most novels are doing several things at once, but usually there are one or two core ideas that feel especially central to what the story is really wrestling with. So for the next few terms, I want to use Frankenstein as my example, and I just wanted to share how fun it was to pull out my high school copy of Frankenstein that is very heavily annotated with different underlines and circles and notes. And when I went back to the back page, this is specifically talking about themes, motifs, and symbols. As you can see, I probably didn't do a lot of great work on this because it's only half a page, and there's definitely a ton of theme and symbolism in this book. But overall, I just wanted to share how fun that was. For Frankenstein, the theme I'd like to point to is the danger of pursuing knowledge or creation without responsibility. Victor does not just want to learn for the sake of understanding the world a little better. He wants to push beyond natural limits. He wants power. He wants to unlock the secret of life itself and prove that he can do what no one else has done. But the moment he succeeds, he refuses responsibility for what he has made. He does not care for the creature, he doesn't guide it, or even try to understand what it will need from him. He creates life and then abandons it. And that neglect is what makes such a strong theme example, because the destruction in the novel does not come only from the act of creation itself, it comes from Victor's failure to take responsibility for the consequences of his own ambition. His pursuit of knowledge becomes dangerous because it is disconnected from care, ethics, and accountability. He wants the glory of discovery, but not the burden that comes with it. That choice ends up destroying not just Victor, but also the creature and the people around them. So the story is not simply saying that ambition is bad, or that curiosity is bad, or even that knowledge itself is bad. It is exploring what happens when ambition is separated from responsibility, when someone reaches for power without thinking through what they owe to the life and damage they create. That's what makes the theme in Frankenstein feel so enduring. It is not just about one scientist making one mistake, but about the danger of wanting to create or control something without being willing to care for what happens next. Next is symbolism. Symbolism is when a person, object, or image represents a deeper meaning beyond its literal role in the story. Something in the story is still real within the world of the book, but it also carries extra meaning that helps deepen the ideas, emotions, and conflicts the story is exploring. A symbol is never just there as decoration. It contributes to what the story is saying underneath the surface. For Frankenstein, I think ice is a really accessible symbolism example. So ice frames the novel in a very memorable way. It appears in frozen, desolate landscapes, especially in the Arctic setting that surrounds the framing narrative, and Victor's final pursuit of the creature. On the literal level, ice is simply part of the setting, but on a symbolic level, it reinforces ideas of isolation, alienation, emotional coldness, and the loss of human connection. Victor ends up chasing the creature across the frozen north, and that setting reflects what his choices have done to him. By that point in the story, he has become cut off from family, companionship, and ordinary human life. His ambition has driven him into a kind of emotional and moral wilderness, and the frozen landscape mirrors that condition. The cold, barren environment reflects the loneliness and bleakness that now define his life. The ice reflects the emotional and moral landscape of the story. It helps externalize what Victor has become and what his pursuit of knowledge has cost him. That's what makes it a symbol. It still functions as part of the setting, but it also points beyond itself to the deeper ideas the novel is exploring about alienation, desolation, and the consequences of cutting yourself off from humanity. And then we get to motif. A motif is a recurring image, idea, or pattern that appears throughout a story and helps support its larger meaning. Unlike a symbol, which is often one object or image carrying deeper significance, a motif usually gains its power through repetition. It keeps showing up across different scenes, characters, or situations, and that repetition helps reinforce the story's themes. And in Frankenstein, a strong motif is isolation. Victor isolates himself in his studies. He cuts himself off from family, friendship, and ordinary human connection in order to pursue his work. At the same time, the creature is also isolated, but in a different way. He is rejected by society again and again, denied companionship, and treated as something outside humanity. So throughout the novel, isolation keeps repeating both as a choice and as a punishment. That recurring pattern matters because it connects directly to the novel's theme. Isolation is part of what allows Victor's pursuit of knowledge to become dangerous in the first place. He works in secrecy. He cuts himself off from accountability. He becomes so consumed by the act of discovery that he stops thinking in human terms about what he is doing and what responsibility he will have once he succeeds. No one is there to challenge him, slow him down, or make him think more carefully about the consequences of creating life. And then after the creature is made, Victor still refuses responsibility. Instead of caring for what he has created, he abandons it. That means isolation does not just shape Victor's downfall, it also shapes the creatures. The creature's forced loneliness, rejection, and exclusion become part of what drives the tragedy forward. So the recurring motif of isolation reinforces the theme that knowledge without responsibility becomes destructive. The novel keeps returning to the loneliness, separation, and alienation because those conditions help explain both the moral failure at the center of the story and the damage that failure causes. At this point, we've gone from how writing feels to what stories mean, and now we're moving into the story craft layer. These are terms that affect how a story is delivered. First is POV, or point of view. POV is about who is telling the story, or more specifically, through whose perspective the reader experiences the story. It determines whose eyes we are looking through, whose thoughts or perceptions we're closest to, and what information the reader is allowed to have access to at any given moment. That means POV is not just a technical label. It has a huge effect on how the story feels and how the reader understands the world. And for this, I'm going to use Mistborn as my example. Mistborn is a really useful POV example because even though it's written in third person, it stays close to a character's perspective, particularly Vin's. So Vin is also learning how this world works, so the reader gets pulled into the setting through her discovery of it. We learn the rules, the politics, the danger, the magic system through what she sees and what she notices and what she does or does not yet understand. So that's what makes POV so powerful. It shapes what the reader knows, when the reader knows it, and how immediate the world feels. If the story were told from a more distant or all-knowing perspective, the world might feel broader, but it would also feel less personal. By staying close to Vin, the story lets this huge fantasy setting feel grounded in one person's lived experience of it. And that's often one of the biggest advantages of close POV in fantasy. It makes a large, complex world feel discoverable instead of overwhelming. Because the reader is not being handed everything at once, we're learning alongside the character, which makes the world feel more intimate, more immediate, and often more emotionally engaging. Now, Brandon Sanderson also occasionally shifts into other POVs, and those switches let him widen the story without losing the intimacy that Vin's perspective gives the book. In his annotations on this, he explains that he was deliberate about when to bring in another character's viewpoint. For example, he held back Elend's POV for a while because keeping readers out of his head preserved uncertainty about his motives, which kept the tension centered on Vin's experience. He also says he sometimes uses an outside viewpoint near the end of a book so he can show a moment in a different way, create contrast, or reveal something the main character's perspective couldn't show as effectively. So in Mistborn, POV is not just about who tells the story, it's also a tool for controlling mystery, emotional distance, and what kind of experience the reader has in a given scene. Next is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is a hint or clue about what's coming later. And Mistborn is a great example of this because Sanderson is constantly planting setup that ends up mattering later. So one example comes from chapter 5. Sanderson explained in his annotations that the reference to northern mystics in this chapter is a foreshadowing of the powers of keepers, such as Sazed. One of their abilities is to make themselves heavier and lighter, but you don't get to see much of that until book 2. So good foreshadowing gives you something early that may not seem important at the time, but later it clicks into place. And when it works, the payoff feels surprising, but still earned. You're really aiming for earned surprise as a writer because that feels good for the readers. And finally, flashback. A flashback is when the narrative jumps back in time to show an earlier event. It's a scene or moment from the past that is brought directly into the story so the reader can experience it, rather than just hearing a character briefly summarize what happened before. That distinction is important because a flashback is not simply any reference to the past. Characters can mention past events all the time without it actually being a flashback. A flashback is a more deliberate return to an earlier moment. So still using Mistborn here, though technically this one comes from book 3 because Sanderson doesn't use a ton of flashbacks. But in this book, there is a flashback involving Spook as a child, showing the day clubs recruited him. And that's useful because it shows what flashback is actually doing in the story. So it's not just dropping information on the reader for the sake of explanation. It's taking the narrative back into an earlier moment in order to reveal something emotionally or narratively important in the present. In this case, the flashback gives us more context for Spook, for clubs, and for the bond between them. It helps us understand their relationship with more emotional weight, because instead of just being told that this history exists, we are brought closer to the moment that shaped it. That makes the backstory feel more immediate and meaningful. And that's really the key thing to understand about flashback. A flashback should usually do more than explain information the reader didn't yet know. It should deepen character, shift our understanding of the present, or add emotional texture that matters to what is happening now. Otherwise, it can just feel like the story is pausing to give us some notes. So when you think about flashback, don't think of it as any mention of the past. Think of it as an actual return to an earlier scene or moment, one that is important enough for the story to step away from the present and let the reader experience it directly. So those are the 3 layers: language and style, meaning, and storycraft. And what I hope this shows you is that literary terms are not just school vocabulary, they're useful tools for fiction writers. They help you describe what prose is doing, they help you describe what a story means, and they help you describe how narrative information is being delivered. If you know these terms, you can read more intentionally and revise more intentionally and talk about your own work with a lot more clarity. And if you want to strengthen your prose even more, check out my crutch words video next. I'll show you how to replace weak, overused words with better options so your writing feels sharper and more engaging to the reader. Thank you for watching and happy writing.